Although the character was featured heavily in 2018's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, audiences for Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse are receiving a ton more backstory on Gwen Stacy, voiced by Haley Steinfeld, one of the more fascinating characters in the Sony slice of Marvel's cinematic universe. Of course, the character dates way back in the comics, long before any mention of multiverses, or even Spider-People who aren't Peter Parker. Gwen Stacy is one of the more significant love interests in Peter Parker's comic book stories, whose tragic fate would not only shape the character for years to come, but also the history of comic book storytelling itself. Though her iconic status pales in comparison to Peter's more wild and passionate romance with Mary Jane Watson, many comic book fans prefer to see Gwen as the love of Peter Parker's life, even if her creators eventually decided the two weren't meant to be. Gwen Stacy could have simply served as a plot device in the story of Peter Parker. Instead, her popularity among Marvel fans has taken her from damsel in distress to a superhero in her own right. No longer the relatively straightforward love interests once portrayed by Emma Stone and Bryce Dallas Howard in live-action Spider-Man movies, the Spider-Verse films portray Gwen as far more competent, complicated, and commanding. Rewinding to her earliest comic book origins, the character has always stood out. When Gwen Stacy was first introduced in 1965's The Amazing Spider-Man #31, Marvel's friendly neighborhood superhero had only been around for about 3 years, although he had become one of Marvel's most popular characters in that short amount of time. Peter Parker encountered his fair share of romantic interests during those early years. There was Betty Brant, Liz Allen, and of course Mary Jane, who somewhat mirrored Peter's attraction towards superheroism in her own attraction to the Spider-Man persona. The introduction of Gwen Stacy would be important for the Peter character, and for Stan Lee as well. Lee claimed multiple times that the design for Gwen was inspired by his wife Joan, who passed away in 2017. He'd follow 1 year later. In a 2017 interview, Stan Lee attempted to explain the power of his muse. "I took one look at her," he recalled, "and she was the girl I had been drawing all my life." Lee credits Joan, who he met in 1947, with inspiring him to create Marvel superheroes like the Fantastic Four at lean times when he had contemplated leaving the comic book industry. Joan Lee's connection to the Spider-Man universe wasn't only limited to inspiration. She also voiced the character of Madame Web in the late 90s Spider-Man, the animated series. Many comic book interpretations of Gwen Stacy, as well as adaptations in film and TV, have depicted her and Peter Parker as high school sweethearts, even flirtatious prior to Peter being bitten by the radioactive spider. In Stacy's comic book debut, however, she and Peter met at Empire State University, a fictional school attended by Marvel characters like Emma Frost, Squirrel Girl, and Johnny Storm. Though their first meetings were standoffish, Peter, after all, was grappling with an ill Aunt May, the two eventually bonded over their shared love of science. Soon, they began dating. As a romantic interest for Peter Parker, Gwen differed greatly from Spider-Man's previous paramours. A science major herself, Gwen was attracted to Peter's intellect rather than any superpowers. This is in stark contrast to Mary Jane, attracted to Peter's persona as Spider-Man, thereby making the two love interests a manifestation of Peter Parker's ceaseless battle between power and responsibility, as Uncle Ben warned him about. Gwen's romance with Peter Parker also carries with it additional stakes, in that her ill-fated police captain father, George Stacy, dies as a result of Peter's actions. His dying words beg Spider-Man to protect Gwen. Though their romance should theoretically be simple, co-ed puppy love, it's far more complicated. Ultimately, in many tellings of their story, and alluded to in Across the Spider-Verse, they are doomed. Gwen Stacy's romance with Peter not only carried dramatic stakes for the web-slinger's comic book story, but she was meant to have an even greater role. Mostly due to Stan Lee's own preference for Gwen, Parker's blonde-haired beau played a central role in the stories of Spider-Man, until readers of Marvel Comics showed a greater interest in the more carefree, wild Mary Jane. Lee had always felt that Mary Jane Watson was a better potential romantic foil for Peter than Gwen Stacy. Marvel Comics writer Jerry Conway said during a 2021 panel. Despite Stan Lee's personal affection for Gwen, Conway felt strongly that not making Mary Jane and Peter a romantic option would be a missed opportunity. Readers tended to agree. But that didn't stop Lee from protesting when Conway came up with an idea that would take Gwen Stacy out of Peter Parker's life for good. and in the process, become one of the most famous moments in comic book history. In one of the most significant comic book issues of Spider-Man's long and storied history, The Amazing Spider-Man 121, released in 1973 and subtitled The Night Gwen Stacy Died, saw the Peter-Gwen storyline end in tragedy. After Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, learned Spider-Man's true identity, he kidnapped Gwen and lured the web-slinger to the George Washington Bridge. In the comic's climactic moment, the Goblin hurled Gwen off the bridge, forcing Peter to try and save her. His spiderweb appeared to catch her in time, but the attempted rescue snapped her neck. Although Gwen's fate would be a defining moment, that almost wasn't the case. After editors had suggested killing off an important character, thoughts turned from Aunt May to Gwen and Mary Jane, the options being whittled down by Conway and illustrator John Romita Sr. As Romita would recount in 2015, the choice of Gwen was just bad timing for her. At that particular moment, she was the more significant character in Peter's love life. In the years to come, Stan Lee would be frequently critical of Conway and Romita's decision to off Gwen Stacy. Interestingly, the cause of her death was also controversial. After much confusion and debate, Marvel Comics would publish an editor's note several issues later, clarifying that Gwen's death was, in fact, caused by the whiplash of Peter's web. The decision to kill off Gwen Stacy shocked comic book readers around the world. But this became far more than just another plot twist in the serialized storytelling of Peter Parker's life. As Arnold T. Blumberg described in his 2003 essay, The Night Gwen Stacy Died, the end of innocence and the birth of the Bronze Age, the death represented a time when a defeated hero could not save the girl, when fantasy merged uncomfortably with reality, and mortality was finally visited on the world of comics. On a wider scale, the storyline would herald a huge shift in comic book storytelling, one that coincided with the end of the Silver Age and the beginning of the Bronze one. A major distinction between these two periods was in their tone. The stories of the Silver Age were dramatically affected by the 1954 Comics Code Authority, forcing content to become more regulated and squeaky clean for audiences. In contrast, the Bronze Age was much darker, with consequential moments such as Gwen Stacy's death becoming the norm. Gwen also became the first of many romantic interests to be killed off for the sake of a male character's story. This would later become such a cliché that it earned the name the Gwen Stacy syndrome. While the consequences of Gwen's death would be felt for decades to come, for Peter Parker's more immediate future, it meant new threats. In other multiverses, Gwen Stacy's story isn't that of the damsel in distress, but the hero herself. Those who have seen Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse got a deep dive into the events that led the Gwen Stacy on Earth 65 to become Spider-Gwen. But few probably know that those events have their origins in Marvel Comics. Spider-Gwen made her debut in 2014's Edge of Spider-Verse comic book series, where the heroic character is introduced in a similar manner to the opening sequence of Across the Spider-Verse. After being bitten by a radioactive spider, Gwen Stacy assumes the role of Spider-Woman in her universe, while her boyfriend, Peter Parker, suffers from bullying. Parker, fed up with being the victim of abuse, uses Dr. Kurt Connor's serum to become the Lizard and attack the school dance, where she's fatally killed by Spider-Gwen, who becomes a fugitive targeted by the NYPD, led by her own father, George Stacy. Following Spider-Gwen's reception from the Spider-Verse storyline, she was given her own ongoing series helmed by comic book writer Jason Latour. Throughout the series, she encounters common Spider-Man antagonists like Kingpin, Vulture, and Kraven the Hunter, while also making alliances with Matt Murdock and Jessica Drew, the Spider-Woman of Earth, 616. Spider-Gwen has made numerous appearances in other Spider-Verse storylines as a totem of the Spider Army, formed by Spider UK in opposition of the Inheritors, whose mission is to hunt all kinds of spider people across the multiverse.